Right, if everyone's okay, can everybody hear me? Yep, all right, a few thumbs up, thank you. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of these talks that I'm giving for your party. Um, Claire is monitoring this, and she's also put the record button on, so it's being recorded. Um, she's also put a message in the chat that the chat is closed, and the reason why. Um, Claire, like myself, is a member of the West Suffolk and Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket group of your party. Um, well, I don't think there's anything more I need to say, is there, Claire? No. Okay. Um, right, I'll get straight on with it then. Um, As you probably know, the first majority Labour government came to power in 1945, um, but then lost power again in 1951. So the question is really, how did this come about that Labour won a majority in 1945? Um, and why did it all go so wrong? Um, so, um, We left off last time at the beginning of the 20th century, and I think to understand how the Labour Party came to power within 45 years of being formed, we need to go back to the First World War because there's a lot that built up to how Labour came to power. So during the First World War, to get men and women to fight for your country, you have to promise them something better afterwards. And soldiers who fought in the First World War were promised a land fit for heroes. The immediate post-war certainly did see improvements for working class people. Lloyd George's Liberal government immediately extended the franchise to all men and to some women over the age of 30. They also initiated reforms to education and housing. So, for example, the giant Becontree estate of 30,000 modern council homes at Dagenham was planned, and that's where I was brought up. But the boom didn't last long. By 1920, depression had set in, which led to mass unemployment. By the following year, 1921, there were over 1 million unemployed, and spending cuts followed from that. Then, having requisitioned the mines during the war, the government returned them to private ownership. Remember that at that time, 1921, over 1 million workers worked down the mines. And in 1921, the coal owners cut miners' pay, and this provoked a strike. Pay cuts and rising unemployment continued until in 1926, the situation had become so dire, and following pressure from the miners and other trade unionists, the TUC called a general strike. 1.7 million workers answered the strike call. Now, whilst it was the right wing TUC leaders who called the strike, thinking that the government and mine owners would back down, it was members of the newly formed Communist Party who played a central role in setting up local strike committees, picketing, organising local Soviets or workers' councils, they were called Soviets, and public meetings during the strike. Of course, Labour Party members played their part as well, but I think the Communist Party was the driving force behind the organisation of the strike. But after just 9 days, the TUC bottled it and they accepted defeat as they almost always do. Now, if you may have seen this flyer going around, if you want to know more about the general strike in 1926, do please come along to this talk by the authors of a new book on the strike. The talk is being organised by West Suffolk Trades Council, of which I'm the chair. Um, if you want to come along, if you look on the Your Party Suffolk Facebook page, I've put the link to book a place. Um, you don't need to book, but we'd like you to, if you can, to give us an idea of how much cake to buy for the event. Um, it's Kevin, the secretary, who's buying the cake, so he needs to know roughly how many people are coming. But it's at the Oddfellows Meeting House. Some of you I know have been there before. Please do book and come along. It should be a really good evening. Um, but what followed the general strike was a massive drop in trade union membership as people became disillusioned. And this led to more cuts in wages and led to more mass unemployment. Unemployment reached 70% in some areas, particularly in northern cities and towns, leaving many workers absolutely destitute because they were denied all benefits for one reason or another. So by the 1930s, there was mass unemployment, poverty, and squalor everywhere in Britain. In fact, Communist Party member Wal Hannington set up the National Unemployed Workers Movement, which came to be a mass movement with branches throughout the country. And I chose this picture in particular of the Stockton branch because this is where my dad came from. Him and all his family moved south to look for work, and they found work. Um, they were building workers. They found work on building the Beacon Tree estate in Dagenham. Also, more famous was the so-called Jarrow Crusade, which was organised by the National Unemployed Workers Movement, and it saw unemployed men march all the way from the northeast to London to protest about unemployment. But come the war, full employment, in inverted commas, was restored during the war with men being conscripted into the armed forces. So after the Second World War, there was a determination that things could not go back to how they were. The wartime experience was also important for a number of other reasons. From 1940, after 20 years in the wilderness of ministerial responsibility, Labour was a full partner in Churchill's coalition government. So during the war, Labour leaders acquired valuable experience of government. Of the 5 members of Churchill's war cabinet, which was formed in May 1940, 2 of them, Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, were Labour MPs. Other Labour members also held ministerial positions. They helped to construct the collectivist practices of wartime, which laid the foundations for a socialist society. Now, in these conditions, post-war domestic policies of the Allied powers were forced to pay regard to the needs of the masses to a greater extent than ever before. So for Britain, the political wartime consensus extended beyond state controls to social reform, enabling the first majority Labour government. One of the most important Labour ministers during the war was Ernest Bevin, not to be confused with Aneurin Bevan with an A. Ernest Bevin was Minister of Labour and National Service. Clearly, his standing as leader of Britain's biggest trade union, the Transport and General Workers Union, was intended to deflect the kind of opposition that there had been to the control of labour, which was very much a feature of the First World War. The measures introduced during the Second World War were similarly strict. The Emergency Powers Act and defence regulations provided the government with all the power it needed to direct and control labour. The 1941 Essential Work Order allowed for the direction of skilled workers to wherever they were most needed. So trade union branches, especially of building workers, were given the powers to direct labour to where it was most needed. Bevin established a joint consultative committee of 7 representatives of employers and 7 trade unionists to advise on the conduct of the war effort on the home front. Coal mining, in particular, was designated as essential war work and empowered Bevin to direct selected conscripts to work in the mines. Many of these conscripts were little more than children, and they became known as the Bevin Boys. One thing that you may or may not be aware of is that one such Bevin boy during the Second World War was one Jimmy Savile. Um, you know, not to be congratulated for what he did later on, of course. One consequence of the greater involvement of trade unions in government during the Second World War was that trade union membership increased from roughly 4.5 million in 1938 to around 7.5 million by 1946. This was especially amongst women who were brought in to do all kinds of jobs that had previously been denied to them. This was accompanied by the spread of recognition agreements to whole industries in which unions had only previously had a toehold before the war. To some extent, this extension of trade union rights was underwritten by the government because the government denied war contracts under the Essential Works Order. They denied war contracts to firms who failed to conform to the minimum standards demanded by the unions. Another factor was the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, whose decisive contribution to the defeat of fascism was very widely acknowledged. For a while, it lessened anti-Sovietism and anti-communism, which had pervaded the interwar years. Also, whereas the 1914-18 war was unpopular because it was perceived as a mismanaged fight between rival imperialisms, the war of 1939-45 was perceived very differently. The mass mobilization of opposition to Germany, Italy, and Japan was motivated by a higher ideal, a determination to rid the world of fascism. Of course, not everybody was a conscious anti-fascist, but as news of the horrors perpetrated by fascism and the heroic resistance movements of nations under its control gradually filtered through, so the war itself took on the character of a people's war, as this slide of the liberation of Paris shows. This was especially the case after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, which was the Nazis dubbed Operation Barbarossa. Although not resulting in the opening of a second front, nevertheless it prompted the government, the British government, to send a flow of supplies and armaments via the dangerous Murmansk convoys. And the TUC assisted this through its Help for Russia Fund and maintained close contact with Soviet trade unions through the Anglo-Russian Trade Union Council, which was established in 1941. Until the end of the war, the anti-communism, which had been the hallmark of the TUC leadership since 1926, was temporarily abandoned. The coalition government also did much more than Lloyd George's administration to spread the burden of sacrifice, although, of course, it didn't equalise it. They spread the burden of sacrifice through state controls, such as rationing, for example, and important measures of social reform. Some reforms included things like the provision of cheap school meals, day nurseries, improved prenatal and infant welfare facilities, abolition of the hated means test to get benefits, emergency housing because of the Blitz. So during the war, socialists also campaigned for greater equality of treatment. For example, after nights of heavy bombing in the East End, Communist Party councillor for Stepney, which is where I was born, Phil Piriton, led a group of East Enders to the Savoy Hotel to invade and occupy their swanky underground shelter and to protest the difference in shelter accommodation for rich and poor. The shelters that the working class had in the East End were not only unsafe, but they were unsanitary and overcrowded. I think my sister could talk a lot more about that because she grew up during the war and had to go down some of those awful shelters that they had in the East End. But EastEnders had also been prevented from taking shelter in underground stations. Government officials believed that if people were allowed to use the deep underground stations, they would develop a defeatist shelter mentality. So later, Phil Piriton also led a group of protesters who stormed and tore down the barriers, preventing people from taking shelter in the underground stations. I think it was Bethnal Green Station where they tore down the barriers. The government eventually relented, and for the duration of the war, underground stations became mass shelters. After the war, Phil Puritan was elected as Communist Party MP for Mile End. He lost his seat in 1951 when the constituency was abolished, so he was the last Communist Party Member of Parliament. But this is just one example of how the class war, as well as the real war, continued during World War II and inspired people to elect a socialist government after the war. Also, in 1942, the Liberal Lord William Beveridge was asked by the wartime government to produce a report on welfare reforms for when the war was over. It was produced in 1943, and its main provisions laid the foundations of a future welfare state. It was accepted by the cabinet, although most of it was not acted upon until the war was over, understandably. What Beveridge did was he identified what he called five giants that needed to be tackled. First of all, want or poverty. Secondly, idleness, unemployment. Thirdly, ignorance, lack of education. Fourthly, disease, poor health. And lastly, squalor, slum housing. And all of this became the heart of Labour's plan to build a new Jerusalem. This captured the imagination of the people. Never again, it was believed, would we allow poverty, unemployment, and the rise of fascism to disfigure our lives. It was further argued and became generally accepted that if we could plan to wage military campaigns, why couldn't we plan to build houses, create a decent health service, an efficient transport system, and so on? Near the end of the war, military units were encouraged to have meetings to discuss social issues for after the war was over, because there was an election going to be staged in 1945. My own father, for example, who was a sergeant in the 82nd Assault Squadron, was detailed by his commanding officer to run such a discussion group for his unit, not despite being a member of the Communist Party, but because of it, because he knew what he was talking about with regard to social reforms. In fact, Tony Benn used to tell a story of one such meeting that he went to where he heard a soldier say this: if we can have full employment to kill Germans, why can't we have full employment to build houses and hospitals and to provide decent services for everyone? And he never forgot it, repeating it on many occasions. I saw Tony Benn speak several times, and he nearly always repeated this. It made such an impression on him. So the central idea behind all Labour's policies was common ownership, where production and services were designed to benefit everyone. So wartime planning led to peacetime planning. It perfectly encapsulated the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. So in 1945, there was an unprecedented period of community spirit. In contrast, at the 1945 election, the Tories were severely punished for a number of reasons. During the election campaign, many people argued that the Tory party were being held to account for Britain's pre-war appeasement of fascism led by Neville Chamberlain. Though it has to be fair to Churchill, he had opposed appeasement of Hitler. However, with their slogan Advance Britannia, The Tory party's campaign was too focused on foreign policy and Churchill as a war hero and cult figure, and not enough on how they were going to rebuild Britain. Churchill actually stood as a national candidate, emphasising nationalist policies. In contrast, Labour offered peace and prosperity at home with workers' rights, social reform, low unemployment, cradle to grave healthcare, and so on. The Tory campaign was also not helped by ill judged comments. So, for example, Churchill claimed that Labour's policies would require, in his words, some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. And as you can see, this was widely reported in the Tory press. Churchill was also regarded as petty by the electorate. He made a series of glib jibes at Attlee like a child in a school playground. This kind of childish rhetoric may be acceptable to some today, especially on social media where we see lots of it, but it certainly wasn't then. He said, Attlee is a modest man, he has much to be modest about. Attlee is a sheep in sheep's clothing, or an empty taxi pulled up outside the House of Commons and Attlee got out. You know, in fact, at an election rally, Churchill was booed off the stage, and this was the war hero just months earlier. So, for all of those reasons, Labour won a landslide and set about implementing its policies outlined in its election manifesto entitled Let's Face the Future. A flurry of legislation covered three main areas. Firstly, nationalisation and economic planning. Secondly, social welfare, and thirdly, trade union law. Labour's programme of nationalisation was extensive and bold. The Bank of England was nationalised in 1946. The National Dock Labour Scheme started in 1947, although Dock Labour remained casual. Remember that this was before containerisation, when half the world's shipping went through the London docks alone. I think I mentioned that last week. Also, the coal industry was taken into state control in 1947. The coal owners in particular had not invested in the mines and had simply been raking in the profits. When the National Coal Board was established in 1947, two trade union leaders were appointed to the board, Walter Citrine of the TUC and Ebby Edwards of the National Union of Mine Workers. In 1948, transport infrastructure, railways, most wharves and docks, London's buses and tubes, and later road haulage were all nationalised. It was argued that, like other public utilities, railways, for example, are a natural monopoly. And it's interesting to look at before nationalisation, there were actually 120 private railways. How they coordinated it all, I'll never know. It's bad enough now with the ones we've got now. Electricity was nationalised in 1948 and the Central Electricity Generating Board was created. As with other utilities, central planning made the service much more efficient and successful because of economies of scale. Also, In 1948, again, arguing that it was a natural monopoly, the gas industry was nationalised. The ailing iron and steel industry was nationalised in 1950. Also, telecommunications was nationalised. In addition, parts of the hotel and catering trade were also in state hands by 1951. By that time, roughly 20% of the national economy was controlled by the state, employing a workforce of over 2 million people. So that's the economic program. On welfare, from the 1930s onwards, Labour was the only party that extended social benefits for all from the cradle to the grave. It became a top campaigning priority. So in 1946, the National Insurance Act provided for sickness and unemployment benefit, old age pensions, and at the time quite generous maternity allowances and death grants. So literally cradle to grave for everyone who had paid the required national insurance contributions. And this was all meant to tackle the giant of want or poverty. The National Insurance Industrial Injuries Act, which insured all workers against workplace accidents, was a measure for which the TUC had fought long and hard. That was also introduced. You probably know if you've worked that all employers have to have insurance for their employees. But probably Labour's greatest achievement of all was the NHS Act, which aimed to tackle the giant of disease. The NHS was, in the words of the bill, to promote the establishment of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people that would be free at the point of need. Labour resolutely opposed the idea of a means test of whether people should be entitled to it or not, because Labour took the view then that the welfare state would be a non-starter unless benefits were genuinely open to everyone. So this principle of universality remained a cornerstone of Labour's social policy for the next 5 decades. Now, prior to the setting up of the NHS, healthcare had been a kind of patchwork of folk remedies, private charity, voluntary and council run provision for all those who couldn't afford to pay. You know, my parents told me about before the National Health Service, when you went to see a doctor, the first thing he or she did was hold their hand out. Not literally, but you know, they wanted payment. But it very nearly didn't happen. Niall Bevan, who was the architect of the NHS, surprised even the Labour Party, who thought the National Health Service was going to be run by local authorities. Instead, what Bevan did was he nationalised every service and every building that could conceivably be regarded as a hospital or health centre. He was demonised by the press and had to weather a storm of protest from the doctors' organisation, the British Medical Association, especially from consultants who wanted to maintain their independence to charge whatever they wanted. They described it as state tyranny. He had to offer concessions and so negotiated a deal with the British Medical Association to allow doctors to keep their private practices. When Asked how he managed against all the odds to get the BMA on board, he said this. Also, in tackling the giant of ignorance, the more liberal Tory Rab Butler, who we'll hear about a bit more later on, had already introduced the Education Act for a more comprehensive secondary education system during the war. That was in 1944. That system became known as the tripartite secondary education system. Now, whilst it had its faults, it was based on the principle of equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. In other words, based on meritocratic principles. For the first time, it brought in the 11 plus exam, which allowed bright, academically minded working class kids to go to grammar school regardless of their parents' income, and for technically gifted kids to go to technical schools, and for more practically minded pupils to go to secondary modern schools. Of course, as it turned out, if you were chosen, in inverted commas, to go to a secondary modern school, this came to be regarded as failing your 11 plus exam. Nevertheless, it was an improvement on what had gone before. There was a high degree of consensus about all these welfare reforms between the left of the Tory party and the Labour leadership, which became known as Butskellism. Butskellism came from the first syllable of the Conservative Chancellor Rab Butler and the last syllable of his Labour counterpart Hugh Gaitskell. So it became known as Butskellism. But in terms of education and attempting to bring our cultural heritage to a wider number of people, Labour went much further, building concert halls, libraries, theatres, sporting venues, and civic centres. And I've included Leigh's swimming pool here, which was a wonderful facility in Dagenham that I spent much of my childhood at. It was built for the 1948 Olympics, which the Labour government agreed to bring to Britain. Leigh swimming pool no longer exists. It was knocked down to build housing, which was such a pity because I spent most of my summers every day as a kid at the swimming pool. Um, and those were the kind of facilities that Labour brought in. Indeed, they hosted, as I say, the 1940 Olympic, 48 Olympics. And 3 years later, um, Herbert Morrison was responsible for the Festival of Britain, which attracted 8 million visitors. On tackling the giant of squalor, remember that most working class people still lived in slums that were already slums when they were thrown up in Victorian times. Add to that fact that 250,000 homes had been flattened during the Blitz and thousands of troops were returning from the front. There was an acute shortage of housing. The 1946 New Towns Act aimed to free people from the smog and cramped living conditions of cities and move them into leafy, close-knit towns in the shires. And the first new town was Stevenage, but there's lots of others like Skelmersdale in the north and so on. The government also authorised local authorities to set up direct labour departments to mass build council houses. The target was a very ambitious 200 to 300,000 homes a year, an incredible target, but they and successive governments achieved those targets. Nye Bevin by then Housing Minister, insisted on a good standard of housing for working people. These schemes of local authorities having direct labour departments and building homes continued for 30 years, right up until that nice lady Thatcher came along. I worked on a number of sites for four different local authority direct labour departments, building council homes as a carpenter in the 60s and 70s. Between 1974 and 1976, I worked on building this estate of flats and houses in Harold Hill, which is near Romford, for the Greater London Council. I worked for the Greater London Council Direct Labour Department. Together with my partner Pete, who we worked as a pair, we built some of the wooden vestibules as seen on the front of these flats. And they're still there, but I don't think that they look as pristine now as they did then. But nevertheless, in terms of trade union legislation, after the 1926 general strike, the Tories had brought in the 1927 Trade Disputes and Trade Union Act to outlaw solidarity strikes and trade unions raising money for political purposes. In 1946, the Labour government repealed that legislation. The Labour Party's trade union membership, that is, the membership that became affiliated from the trade unions to the Labour Party, rose dramatically because the 1946 Act restored contracting in for purposes of payment of the political levy. Also, they taxed the rich greater, and we hear a lot about that today. Inheritance tax rate was raised to 80% in 1949. This was part of inheritance tax in various forms had been around since probably the 18th century. But under Attlee's administration, it was expanded and intensified, making it the highest rate in British history, reflecting the government's commitment to a more equitable society. This was part of broader fiscal policies aimed at wealth redistribution and funding post-war reconstruction. The 80% rate remained in place until the 1970s, when it was gradually reduced. They also implemented a special contribution on investment income above £5,000. When combined with a basic rate income tax of 45% and a surtax of 52.5%, it resulted in an effective marginal tax rate of 147.5%, the highest in UK history. This rate, by the way, was applied only to investment income, not earned income. So that was what the Labour government did between 1945 and 1950. Some or of all of this is discussed in this great film by Ken Loach. If you haven't seen it, please do. You can rent it on YouTube. So after all these achievements, what went wrong? Why did Labour lose so many seats in 1950 and then lose the election in 1951? There are a whole number of reasons that I can put forward why that happened, and you might think of other things I don't know. Well, firstly, the Labour government inherited severe economic problems of the pre-war period, with the added burden of the economic destabilisation brought about by the war. British exports in 1945 stood at just a third of their already low 1939 level. We were exporting only a third of what we had in 1939. Britain was basically bankrupt. All our foreign investments had been sold. We had lost most of our ships. We had run out of dollars, and three-quarters of industry was at the time engaged in producing munitions. So they did face an almost impossible task. They had expected that the money that had been given to Britain by America for the war effort would be written off. Instead, President Truman sent the British government a bill for $3.5 billion. The economist John Maynard Keynes was sent to the White House to try to negotiate an £8 billion gift. All he got was £4 billion, and that was a loan, and even that was conditional on scrapping exchange controls. This led to economic dependence on America, and Britain never finished paying it back until 2006. So Labour's economic plan, such as it was in tatters. A return to economic orthodoxy was also motivated by the government's reliance on US aid in the form of the Marshall Plan, which was to provide aid to most of Europe. But the price for that aid was clearly stated by the Americans. Britain had to cut back on spending on welfare and had to decontrol the economy in order to make the entire European market more favourable for American exports. The clamour for decontrol of the economy also became the rallying cry of private industry, backed by the Tory party and, of course, the Tory press. By 1947, Labour had been forced to embark upon a series of austerity measures which effectively transformed it from a party of reforming zeal into one of retrenchment and economic orthodoxy. An attempt was made to reduce the balance of payments deficit by cutting down on imports. This affected imported foodstuffs, especially, and meant a cut in the already meagre rationing still existing from the war years. I can just about remember rationing or some of the rationing was still in place when I was little. The black market provided extra rations for those who could afford it. 1947 also saw the coldest winter of the century. The railways were blocked, coal couldn't be moved, and power stations were closed. 2 million workers were laid off, and there was a genuine fear of famine. Britain faced the gravest financial crisis since 1931. Domestic spending on social services was cut drastically, and in 1948, the government introduced a wage freeze. Rationing was biting more than during the war years. Also, one of the things that I think is one of the reasons Labour lost was that nationalisation of basic industries was also problematic. To start with, only decaying and unprofitable sectors of the economy were taken into state control in order, as Herbert Morrison put it, to make possible the organisation of a more efficient industry in the interests of the nation as a whole. The mines and railways in particular, as I've already said, were absolutely bankrupt. This, plus the fact that the astronomical sums in compensation payments were given to former owners, many of whom actually became leading figures on the boards of directors of their respective public corporations. And this helps explain why there was so little opposition from the capitalist class to nationalisation, except in the case of iron and steel, where there was a great deal of opposition. Indeed, I think one of the problems stemmed from Labour's statement of aims, which, clause 4, you may remember, was absolutely fine on its own, but it was never spelt out how common ownership would be carried out in practice. Now, common ownership can mean many things. It can mean worker cooperatives, work under the democratic control of local authorities, and so on. So, although the Labour Party had adopted a policy of public ownership in 1944, this was interpreted to mean top-down nationalisation by Herbert Morrison, who led the programme. It certainly wasn't workers' control. Corporate bureaucrats were simply replaced by state bureaucrats, many of whom were former owners. Many people couldn't see the difference. Also, most of the old hierarchies and their repositories, such as the gentlemen's clubs, the public schools, the House of Lords and the honours system, and the aristocracy, remained intact as a base from which to resist and fight back by the ruling class. Furthermore, I think that financial institutions, which remain largely untouched, enabled the capitalist class to still have an unhealthy influence on economic policy. On welfare reform, whilst there was a massive step forward from what existed before the war, the ideology that underpinned it was based on the views of William Beveridge, who was certainly no socialist, but was a very puritanical liberal. He argued in the report, in imperialist and sexist terms, that housewives as mothers have vital work to do in ensuring the adequate continuance of the British race and of British ideals in the world. And he also said there should be compulsory training camps for malingerers, almost like concentration camps. He actually hated the term welfare state because he said it implied a Santa Claus state. Benefit in return for contributions was his mantra. He put an emphasis on duties, not on rights. So, in this very influential book, George and Wilding described Beveridge, as well as other luminaries of the period, like Keynes, Galbraith, and Gilmore, as reluctant collectivists that were committed to what they call welfare capitalism rather than democratic socialism. This kind of ideology permeated the Labour Party's legislation, which resulted in welfare payments only just above subsistence level. So whilst it was vastly better than the pre-war means test, it tended to entrench claimants in poverty rather than lift them out of it. I don't know, I think this book is now in about its 7th edition or something like that. It's very good if you get a chance to read it. So despite all these problems, Labour actually won more votes than the Tories in the 1951 election, But because of the result of boundary changes, the Tories won an undeserved slim majority and so secured their position as the party of government for the next 13 years. So hopefully, at the end of this, I've answered the question, hopefully, why did Labour win in 1945? And hopefully, I've also provided some possible reasons why Labour had a vastly reduced majority of only 5 seats in 1950 and then lost in 1951. And I think the question is, what lessons can we learn from all this as socialists? So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. So I'll hand back to you, Claire. Let's
Thank you, Jack. That was really informative. I always learn something new when you're doing talks. I hope everyone else
well,
enjoyed it.
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just open up the chat and see if there's any questions.
All right, stop the share. There we go.
Okay. If anyone wants to type in the chat or raise their hands, if you've got any questions for Jack. Just put this down. Right, I've got to get the recording for Jack. Who's this? Oh, never trust the Americans.
No, yes, I think that's coming back to bite us as well. Yeah. Okay.
Is this?
You know it's 8 o'clock and my team are just about to kick off against
Okay.
Crystal Palace. So um and I'm missing it. But no, I'll stay till 1/2 past if people have got questions.
Kevin's got his hands up, Jack.
Kevin, yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Kevin.
That's good, Jack. Very, very cool. What I had realised, I had this hearing the record prime minister on the was you it was
Sorry, Kevin, but you've got an echo going on.
I'm not sure. Have a look. Is that any better? I figure I like trying my same time. Is that any better?
A little better.
Okay. What I'm going to do is, so you, how much questions do you want to hear? Start. 1 second. Let me just something else. Okay, is this any better?
Oh, that's much better, Kevin. Yeah.
Okay. It's because I was using my phone because I haven't got my microphone on my desktop is playing up, but I was using the desktop and the phone at the same time. Okay, so did you hear any of my question or should I start again?
No, I didn't. Start again.
Okay, so my observation was that during the war, it was kind of seen that Churchill was the prime minister, and therefore I think many people think, oh, it must have been the Tories that were like the government during the war. But you mentioned that it was coalition government, so I just wondered, was it full coalition or how did that work?
Well, Labour had 40% of the cabinet. The Tories had 60%, and of course, the Prime Minister being Churchill. So they were minority partners, but quite a big minority.
Okay. That was quite interesting, actually. I mean, that's the first time I was aware that it was a coalition. I don't know if I've missed it at some other time. That's not me growling, by the way. That's one of my beagles telling one of the other ones to behave themselves.
All right. Okay. All right.
I,
Thanks, Kevin.
I shall leave someone else, hopefully, to ask a question.
Yeah. Does somebody else want to come in? Either a question or an observation or.
Somebody's asked what the book was called, Jack. Was it called Ideology in Social Welfare or something?
Yeah. Yeah. Ideology and Social Welfare. It's by George and Wilding.
And Edward has his hand up.
Edward, yeah, please come in. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you loud and clear, Edward. Yeah.
Cool. So you made some very good points, I think, about the degree of, sort of state bureaucracy controlling sort of its industry after World War II, and the degree to which it was just more of a sort of, it could be argued as state capitalism over sort of genuine socialism, genuine workers' power. What do you think? What do you think about the idea that a similar argument being made for the idea of full employment as a sort of policy since the war, and that way as sort of controlling as a very sort of top-down form of control, and also something that potentially has the risk of creating a lot of people, a lot of more jobs than are necessary, potentially a lot of so-called bullshit jobs that don't actually mean much, or in which a lot of people are stuck in jobs that don't find satisfying. What would you what do you think about sort of the sort of policy going forward in a more socialist society should be? Should we look at full employment, or should we look at other approaches?
Well, I think we should look at full employment, but uh, why do we have to work 40 hours a week? Um, there should at least be a 35-hour week now. And also, employers, some more progressive employers have been experimenting with 4-day weeks, and they find that their productivity has gone up over the week because people have a 3-day weekend to get done all the other things they want to do and have more leisure time, and they're more relaxed in their work. Um, and that's one thing. As far as workers, as far as not creating state bureaucracies, I think there's a number of things that can be done. But from my point of view, and other people may differ with this, I think it differs between industries. So, for example, I'm very familiar with the construction industry because I worked in it for 25 years. Um, and I think there are a number of things that can be done in the construction industry. For example, we need a mass house building program. That should be done by local authorities, and we should resurrect, because I worked for 4 of them, and they built really good council homes for working class people. So local authorities to build houses. When it comes to big infrastructure projects, there was a massive chance to create a national building company when Carillion went bust, because we could have taken over all of their contracts and so on, to build things like power stations, motorways, hospitals, and so on. So you'd have another sector. And then, perhaps encouragement for worker cooperatives, for small scale jobs that, jobbing builders. So, that would be in that industry. And, I'm not an expert on other industries, but I suspect that other forms of ownership would work better in other industries. So I don't know whether that does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Thanks very much for that.
Okay, Edward. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and somebody else? Anybody else got a hand up or? Yeah, one other thing I would say is, I did mention it during that talk, is the Ken Loach film, The Spirit of 45. If you've never seen it, you really should see it. And as I say, you can rent it off YouTube. And as you probably know, Ken Loach, the filmmaker, has made lots of socialist films during his career, and he was also thrown out of the Labour Party by the Starmerites, um, along with a lot of others. Ah, Delilah, please. Yeah, Delilah, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, I'm from one of the like those new towns that they set up, or I guess massively gentrified at the time, depending on the specific case. But yeah, and I always thought of it um, as being like built up primarily for like Polish and other like post-war like refugee immigrants. Um, so I, I, I guess now it obviously makes sense that obviously with the Blitz and the summers beforehand that it's not like solely for that for like people from other countries that we took in after the war, but or during, but yeah, so, I guess my question is like just for any other info floating around in your noggin about that.
Well, it's interesting that the first wave of mass immigration to Britain was the Windrush generation. Of course, it came from the West Indies. Um, Many of the first immigrants, they settled in private accommodation, um, a lot across South London, Brixton, and places like that, and a lot of it was run by slum landlords. And have you heard of Rachmanism? No. Rachman was a slum landlord that owned thousands and thousands of properties across South London, and he used basically heavies to go round and put pressure on people not to complain about the conditions that they were living in, and they were absolutely awful. The other thing I would say was that with immigration of Asians which started, in the 60s and 70s, large scale Asian immigration, is that a very high proportion of them were building workers. Because I actually worked on one building site that was all the carpenters were Bangladeshi except me. I was the only one that wasn't. So they were building homes rather than taking homes. And, a lot of this rhetoric from Reform at the moment about, oh, they're all coming over here to get council houses. Asylum seekers cannot apply for council houses. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of my answer to it. But a lot of the new towns were really to take people out of. I mean, I come from the East End of London, and there was Basildon, Harlow, and Harold Hill, which I already mentioned, which took lots and lots of people. And there's a very good book by Young and Wilmot, which is called, oh, I just can't think of the name of it now. Um, uh, it's about the East End, people moving out of the East End to Harold Hill, but he gave it a pseudonym. Um, it was a really good piece of research into, so a lot, and similarly up north, a lot of people were moved out of Liverpool to places like Skelmersdale, new towns, so they were moved out of these slums in the cities. Yeah. So thanks, Dave. Right, have we got anybody else?
I'd like, I think, unless does anyone else want to talk? No. I just wanted to say my grandparents came over in 1950 from Ireland and moved to Ladbroke Grove where there was a lot of the Windrush generation as well. And they were our neighbours and Portobello Road and all of that. And mine they had three daughters and my granddad worked on a building site and he was killed on the
Oh,
site. So yeah, and then my nan was 8 months pregnant, and and then a month later she had their son and named him after him. So she was like a young widow with four children, and it was really, really,
yeah,
really tough. And then you've got all the no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, and that as well, and
yeah,
and but she had six children in the end and remarried, and they contributed so much to society and to rebuilding the
yeah.
country.
Oh, well, I worked with a lot of Irish workers. I couldn't keep up with the Guinness drinking at lunchtime, but
Mm.
um, apart from that, yeah, um, yeah, a lot of my friends were who, were good trade unionists as well in the construction industry, came from Ireland. Yeah,
Jackie, the Spirit of 45.
The Spirit of 45 was the film by Ken Loach. Yeah, so
Mm.
Kevin asked it. Yeah,
Max has raised his hand as well,
Max.
unless
Yeah,
Jackie wanted to say something else.
no, go on, Max.
A quick question, sort of from a political history perspective. The period from the 45 election to the 51 election seems to have heralded, a catalyst for building remarkable systems that have survived, in whole or in part, 50, 60 years of attempted retrenchment after Labor loses the election. I guess from a political side, do you know, was the Labour Party ready to govern from day one? Did they have to spend much of their mandate figuring things out? Like, I guess from a preparation and then implementation perspective, it seems like there are these windows of opportunity for social change. And I'm just curious to what extent, if Labour sort of built it on the fly. Was there a surprise about the results of the election, or were they ready to govern? I guess is kind of the question.
Yeah, I don't really know. One thing that has been said is that the Tories, from gauging uh, um, from what people were saying at home in Britain, the Tories were quite confident of winning. But of course, there was these thousands and thousands of troops coming back, especially from the Far East, and um, it was it's been argued that it was their vote that made all the difference. So whether they were prepared for it or not, I'm not really sure. But I think, people, as I said, I think the war laid a lot of the groundwork, and the Beveridge report provided a template, if you like. But the actual planning of it, I'm not really sure. How the implementation of it, whether they were ready to implement it. I suspect not. And a lot of it was putting through a lot of legislation off the hoof. Um, but that's just my feeling, Max. I don't really know.
Oh, well, thank you.
Right. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you all for coming along. Um, Next week, I'm going to look at what happened after, in that period after 1945, after 1951, right up until Margaret Thatcher came along. And look at the kind of consensus that existed amongst major politicians during that whole period, the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, and how it all started to break down in the 1970s. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to look at next week, if that's okay with everyone. And thank you all for coming. If you've got no more questions, I think we'll close it now. Okay, and thank you for your lovely comments as well.
Thank you, Jack. And thank you, everyone.
Okay, and thanks for chairing, Claire.
Oh, that's a pleasure.